So I'm not from Northampton. Um, I went to Liverpool University in July 1973. Well, I left Liverpool University in July 73, having studied physics, maths, and philosophy. But during my time there, I'd gone on two summer digs. Well, I'd gone on the same dig 2 summers running. When it came time to leave university, it was either do I get a proper job? I didn't fancy that, so I thought I'll give this archaeology a go for 12 months, 18 months, see what happens. And so here I am 50 years later, I'm retired from paid work, but still involved in archaeology. So, and what we're talking about tonight is rescue archaeology, well, stroke what we now know as commercial archaeology. So it's all archaeology that's being carried out in advance of development work of one sort or another. So I started back in 73, and so I've been working about 3 years and moving around the country, job to job. There are very few full-time jobs in archaeology in those days, so it's a case of wandering around the country, place to place. And October 76, I arrived in Northampton to work for the old Development Corporation on a 3-month contract. 37 years later, in 2013, my final excavation was in the outer bailey of Northampton Castle, the old station car park, where I'd arrived all those years before, knowing nothing about Northampton at all. So, and you can see from the list there, Development Corporation, most of the time I've been involved with Northamptonshire archaeology in the old county council. And then we got outsourced to Museum of London Archaeology, and then I retired in 2018, but I'm still involved through the Northamptonshire Archaeological Society. So this is the only page we're going to get tonight that hasn't got a picture on it. So during those 50 years I've been involved, the whole organisation of funding of archaeology has changed considerably. So, well, 3 stages: rescue archaeology back in the 1950s, right through the 60s. Developers could get away with just about anything, really. There was no protection. The only protected sites were the scheduled monuments, the castles, the abbeys, and so on, things you could see. And so we had lots of hidden archaeology, hidden underground, which we knew nothing about. And if a developer started to disturb something, it very much depended on someone noticing and getting some public interest going and some support, and perhaps going to the old Department of the Environment, who could issue grants for excavations. So only a few permanent staff, volunteers on subsistence allowances. So when I started in 73, I was getting that £1.50 a day, £10.50 a week. New local archaeological societies were appearing in those days, and they were also digging. But by the mid to late 60s, it was becoming obvious far more was being destroyed than anybody could cope with as the lack of any system then. So from the late 60s onwards into the early 70s, you start getting local government archaeology starts to appear. We get a structure starts to be built up, county archaeologists, sites and monuments records. So there's a record of what's known about the county, which can be used as a reference for when planning applications are coming in. We also get the growth of archaeology units, teams that can actually go out and dig that archaeology before it gets destroyed. And the other very important thing is they start applying conditions to planning consents, which to allow time for archaeological works. Initially, it was still very dependent on those Department of Environment grants. Then from the mid-70s right through the 80s, the thing that saved archaeology was lots of unemployed people in those days. And the Manpower Services Commission was there to provide money to employ the unemployed, who certainly in the 1980s they were getting £10 a week on top of their benefits to come and work in archaeology. All that came to an end in 1990 when the Manpower Services Commission came to an end, which was from the archaeological point of view was a crisis. How are we going to get the sites dug without people to dig them? And that was where developer funding came in. So introduced in 1990, the developer would have to pay the costs for exploring the archaeology on the development sites. And the work required was built into the planning consents. So they had they had little choice really. They had to cover that as part of their planning application, their planning consent. Brought in things like competitive tendering between organisations, but it certainly led to a huge increase in the number of people earning a living through development-led archaeology. and also, of course, the number of archaeological sites were actually being looked at. So that's the broad introduction. Now we're going to go all the way back to well, we might as well start back in the Ice Ages. So no Northampton now. We're way back before that. So as the Ice Ages come to an end, of course, the landscape starts to regenerate. Animals and people start to move in. So the Den Valley provided all they needed to survive. So you got our Mesolithic people of the Middle Stone Age. They had the river with fish and birds, wooded slopes for game, building materials. They used small work flints, microliths, as knives, often mounted together to make other tools. They could use the small flint nodules from the local gravels. And towards the end of the Mesolithic, quite likely they were starting to create clearings in the woodland, so grass for grazing. So they were starting to encourage the animals, in a sense, to come to them. So the process almost of domestication was almost beginning to start in that Middle Stone Age period. But of course, Mesolithic and later flints have been found in quantity along the margins of the Nen Valley. At Duston, an area of the an area including the old Roman town was being quarried in the 19th century. They recovered thousands of flint implements, including some early ones. At Chalk Lane Car Park in the centre of Northampton, there were soil horizons preserved under the castle bank. Obviously, they'd sat there for 1,000 years, preserved and undisturbed. Some of that they contained flints as well. And also, I see tonight somebody from Briar Hill, the Briar Hill Neolithic causewayed enclosure produced thousands of flints as well, some of them going back to the Mesolithic period. But of course, very little below ground evidence. It's just those residual flints we were finding. To start actually finding some stuff in the ground, we get onto the early Neolithic. So we're looking now 4,000 to 3,300 BC for the early Neolithic. The DNA evidence, which has been making big differences to our understanding in the last few years. These weren't the Mesolithic, the hunter-gatherers turning over to pastoral and arable farming. These were new people coming in from the continent. They were bringing with them their domesticated cattle and sheep and goats, or sheep/goats, and cereal grains for sowing. So, but up to the 1960s, Northamptonshire and the Midlands in general was thought to have very little Neolithic or Bronze Age settlement because, of course, the simple argument, there was very little above ground. You go down to Wessex and so on, and you get all those lovely earthworks and round barrows and so on. None of that existed in the Midlands, or very little of it, so people assumed there wasn't much going on here. The big change really came about in the beginning of the mid-60s when lots of people start doing aerial photography along the river valleys of the Midlands in general, and of course in this county it's along the Nen Valley, and they started to see lots of sites started appearing. So of course it wasn't that the sites hadn't been there, it was just that we couldn't see them because they'd been largely flattened by the centuries of ploughing that had gone on in the Nen Valley's great agricultural land. So it's been intensively ploughed, well, from the Iron Age onwards, really. And so many of those sites have been levelled. The first one we're beginning with is the site that brought me to Northampton, is the Briar Hill Neolithic causewayed enclosure. Hopefully you can see my arrow. We've got down at the bottom on the left, we've got the Hunsbury Hill, the earthworks of the Iron Age hill fort. As you come down slope, there was this roughly circular enclosure system that appeared on aerial photographs. On the right, we see that's a very early piece of geophysics work that was done on the site there. Well before the days of computers and so on, it was using graph plotters, and so fairly basic stuff and time-consuming, but it produced a basic plan of our site. And this sort of site was similar to others that were known in southern England. So excavated in the mid to late 1970s by the NDC prior to new housing. And well, I spent most of my previous 3 years in archaeology working mainly, doing a bit of medieval, but mainly Iron Age and Roman. And I wanted to do something early. So the job in Northampton was the only job that winter that was going to work on an early site. So in the end, that was what brought me it was coming to dig the Briar Hill causeway enclosure that brought me to Northampton in the first place. I won't say too much. Well, it's made up of intercutting pits with many gaps. So it's not no way can you argue this is a defensive circuit. The broad interpretation would be that they're defining a space for seasonal gatherings. So if you like, a Neolithic community centre. And obviously the size of that site, it's one of the first extensive excavation on a prehistoric site. Certainly one as early as the Neolithic in Northampton, and one of the early ones in Northamptonshire as well. The ditches themselves, just a brief look at them. Very impressive ditches when you think they're using antler picks and cattle shoulder blades for shovels. And they're cutting down through the ironstone up to a metre and a half. In some places, some of the ditches were nearly getting on for 2 metres deep. We've got a plan of the site there with our series of ditches, and you can see how they're made up of these elongated pits with lots of gaps between them. There's also a little bit of the Iron Age in red and Roman in blue, and the little light blue rectangles are Anglo-Saxon. So we've got a whole chronology there of what we're going to look at tonight and beyond for the development of the town. One of the most interesting aspects, though, is in this southern half of the enclosure, this horseshoe-shaped feature, what I called here the grooved ware. Or the grooved ware is the pottery that helps give us the date, along with radiocarbon dating for this into the late Neolithic. And these foundations, these big slots either side, would have held, I think, 3 posts each side. We've got an entrance from the right and a shallow back wall. And this is certainly the remains of the earliest remains we've got of a timber building from the county. So Briar Hill can claim that to be the location of our earliest recorded building. We'll jump on now to something a lot more recent. So there, 72 at Briar Hill, we're in the very early days of starting to explore in the mid-70s, but at the very early days of exploring the prehistory of the county. Now we're coming up to, if anybody knows, Dallington Grange, the whole Harleston Heath area has been the centre for much development in recent years, and more to come. And also, of course, it's a centre for lots of archaeological excavation. So we have a second causewayed enclosure. Not many places have two. And we've got that little oval ring there. Is another one of these Neolithic causewayed enclosures. There's been a little bit of trial trenching there in the past. And it was actually in the local newspaper last week. The planning permission has gone ahead for all this area to disappear under housing. Except these are Iron Age and Roman. I assume the Iron Age and Roman sites will be excavated. It was decided that the causewayed enclosure will be preserved within the development. So if you look at the housing plans, you'll see this little oval area of green, and that's the site of the Neolithic causewayed enclosure. So it's rather a pity in some ways. I quite like to excavate another one, or somebody might to see another one excavated anyway. But that will actually be preserved within that landscape. We'll be coming back to that landscape later to look at some more of it. So, actually got some more there. So one thing that has been done recently was some new geophysics. A bit confusing, this plan. So you've got the aerial photograph plot and the geophysics, which makes it look double in places. But the geophysics survey done a few years ago, because of all the development that's going to happen, suggested we've just got this single broken ditch, and what was originally thought to be a small enclosure at the centre is now, the geophysics doesn't confirm that. There's lots of other things going on, but not an internal enclosure. So we can move on now. So that's our 2 big early Neolithic sites from that period, 4000 BC onwards. We now come same area. There's Hunsbury Hill, there's Briar Hill, and we're going to go over to Banbury Lane. This area went for housing some years ago, and a middle Neolithic tragedy. So new wave of housing around the margins of Northampton. This is where we're picking up these sites. So it's of all periods, of course. We don't have much prehistory in the middle of Northampton. Well, there's a little bit. It's all as the town spreads outwards. We're seeing, in fact, from the 70s onwards, as the town has spread and grown, it's brought more of these sites to light. So Banbury Lane, there's the site in excavation. And plan of the site, we've got quite a small site. Only there's a 10-metre scale, so it's nothing like the size of Briar Hill. A small triple ditch system. Got an entrance to the northwest. There was probably another entrance there that was later blocked. The little inner ditch is continuous, except here, where it's cut by a sizable pit. And when they started digging this pit, it was found to be stacked. Well, we didn't know how deep it was at first, but that's all human bone. And that goes on for over half a metre. So the pit was stacked top to bottom with disarticulated human bone. So we've got the partial remains of about 150 people from the Middle Neolithic. And I believe it is the largest collection of human bone of this date in the UK. So, but it's only selected bones. So to record it, it was all taken down sort of one layer of bone at a time. So that's one photograph. And I believe there's about a dozen or more layers of that bone that were all recorded one by one as they went down to the bottom of the pit. So we've got femurs. You can see lots of the main long bones there are femurs, followed by tibias. Then you've got the arm bones. There's a few skulls out here in that corner, but vertebrae and ribs are rare. There's no hand or foot bones, so the bones have been brought from somewhere else. So the bodies had decayed back down to the skeletal stage, and they've collected the major bones and brought them to be buried in this pit. There's obviously a very complex story behind all this. It also believes that the deposit all goes in at one time. It's not an accumulation of bones over a long period, or the bones have been collected somewhere else over a long period of time and are then brought here. So there's still a complex story to tell here, but we'll never know the full truth of what happened. And I can't really say any more about it because it's not my site. This is a site that's being written up now by Mola, and hopefully they'll be publishing the results in the not too distant future. But it's a unique site in the country. Nobody's ever found a pit containing this amount of human bone from this date before, so it's something very special and unusual. Those sites, we've looked at two sites now. We've looked at Briar Hill. We've gone down here to Banbury Lane. These are quite big sites that were recognised as being prehistoric, and a team has gone out to excavate them. There are also little small outbreaks of Neolithic, which also it's chance finds, which the sort of thing you're only going to find on a later settlement site, because there's no way they'll be recorded by geophysics or aerial photography. So down here at the southwest of the town at Milton Ham, the grey, that's the ditches of a late Iron Age into Roman settlement. But among that, there was 3 little pits containing cremation burials and a couple of other pits, none of which were producing Roman or Iron Age pottery. So they were believed to be earlier. Because when they were one of the cremation burials was radiocarbon dated, it came out again with one of these Middle Neolithic dates, about the same as the bones that were in that pit over at Banbury Lane. And as you can see, not a great deal to it. We've got a shallow little hole in the ground. You can see the white of the cremated bone. That's obviously been truncated by ploughing in the past. So as you can see, if it hadn't been on this site, if it hadn't happened to have a later Roman settlement plonked on top of it, sort of thing you would never notice. But there are 3 pits containing cremation burials. Only 800 grams of cremated bone had survived, enough to give us a radiocarbon date to put it in there. So it's a sort of small-scale evidence that can only come up by getting lucky. And most often, of course, that does mean you're excavating something later, Iron Age or Roman, and a few features within that site happen to be of much earlier date. Right, that's the Neolithic. We're now going on to the early Bronze Age. And I'm cheating here. Again, these are new settlers. So from 2500 BC, we have the Beaker people appearing. They're coming from the continent, and the important thing they're bringing with them, well, bronze working, that also includes gold as well. And they're highly decorated pots, which is why they have this name, the Beaker people. And we do have, and they of course bring in round barrow burial. And burials are important people under mounds. We do have some we'll be looking at in a minute, but none of the ones in around Northampton are well preserved. So I'm not cheating here. I'm going back to a site I excavated at Raunds in the 1980s just to show these are wonderful things to dig because they produce rich inhumation burials with grave goods. So from an archaeological point of view, they're a treasure trove of information, especially here. This came up unexpectedly under a medieval village. So the dark soil there is part of the central mound, and we've got gravel thrown up around that to make a gravel cap mound. Then they've enlarged the mound again, so you can see these lines of gravel. This is all partially preserved mound. And when it's all stripped away, we come down to the 3 ditches underneath. Second ditch there. There's a third ditch right out around here. So, and there I am just starting to uncover the central burial just behind that ranging pole. So if you're lucky and you get to dig a nice, well-preserved beaker round barrow, you can get something like this, the crouched inhumation, little flint knife up by the hands. There's the beaker that's fallen over and been crushed in the ground. We've got a flint knife, and we've got a perforated jet button, and there's the grave goods on the right. And this brings me Northampton. Some of you may know, or perhaps you don't, that a couple of weeks ago a new exhibition opened at Northampton Museum. It's a history of Northampton in 100 objects, and it runs from, I think one of the oldest objects is a dinosaur footprint, and one of the more modern most modern ones is a Formula One racing car. So it spans that well, millions of years, quite literally. There is a collection in the middle that relates to all the archaeology we're talking about tonight. So that beaker pot at the bottom is one of the objects in the 100 objects exhibition, and there'll be a few others appearing later on. We can, well, whatever period of history you're interested in, there'll be something, everything from dinosaurs to Formula One racing cars. So something for everybody. So, well, that's what a beaker barrow can be like. Preserved mound deposits, a wonderful set of ditches where it's been enlarged, and lovely grave goods. And for once, we can actually go right into the heart of this, something some of you would have seen before in a previous lecture. Right at the heart of Northampton, and the very origins of Northampton. In the early 1970s, they were excavating along St. Peter's Street. And at this end, the west end of the site, they picked up a curving arc of ditch, and which is obviously, well, part of a prehistoric monument. And if you run the ditch round to a circle, you end up with a 25-meter diameter ring ditch. So we're looking at a possible Bronze Age round barrow sitting on that hillside, looking above the River Nen. And there's our potential early church and the timber hall, Anglo-Saxon timber hall, and so on. So there is the possibility here that the church and its complex of other buildings were sited on this position because there was a visible round barrow there, and they've chosen to set up next to an existing site of antiquity and importance to them. They recognised it's a burial mound, so where else would you set up a church except next to an existing burial mound? So that's a possibility. And we go on back to chance burial. So other things, we had the earlier one with those little cremation burials. The whole west side of the town, of course, that plan's way out of date now. From Upton, the developments in spreading westward quite rapidly. If we go back to the early stages of that in 2011, there was a watching brief being carried out down on the floodplain when the new road was going in, and a collard burial appeared from nowhere. And perhaps if we go on to the next one, we're down by the river. There's just a couple of little pits, and literally this was somebody doing what can be a very tedious job. They're watching the box scrapers just clearing the ground along the road line. Most of the time there is nothing to see, and then suddenly something like this happens. The box scraper has just clipped the base of an inverted urn, so you can see the black rim of the pottery. There's some scattered sherds there, and there was some bone visible inside. So in the middle of this expanse of clays, suddenly there's a collard urn burial, and you can see here after excavation, there's the broken base again, and they've uncovered the pot buried upside down in its pit. And well, so a complete chance. If the watching brief hadn't been done, the box scraper would have just run through and taken the whole thing out. We're slightly later now, slightly later in the early Bronze Age. We're moving on to sort of 1900, 1850. And the urn was lifted and then excavated in the office. So you can see here we've taken out the pots all fractured, so which is quite useful. So part of the side could be taken away, and now you can see the cremated bone in the bottom of the inverted urn. And that's my wife Pat, who's some more of the pot's been removed, and now she's excavating the pot, so carefully taking it down stage by stage. And if we go over, oops. In the background, we have the drawing board clean to record the record. So we come in. There's the section view. After taking those broken sherds of the pot away, you can get this lovely, you can see all the white fragments of bone embedded in the soil. And if you look at the section drawing, we can start to, while it's just cremated bone dumped in a pot, there's still, if it's excavated carefully, you can still learn quite a bit about the whole rite of cremation burial at the time. And what they've done here, so obviously the urn starts the right way up. In the bottom of the urn are the larger fragments of bone, including the skull fragments. So first of all, they carefully, from the cremation pyre, they've collected fragments of skull and fragments of long bone, placed those in the pot. Then they move on to the smaller fragments, which go in above that. And then right at the very end, there's some bits of charcoal and material there. So it's almost like the scrapings. Some of the pyre debris has actually been scraped up and is placed on the top of the bone deposits. So you get this whole, don't just shovel up some ashes and put it in an urn. These bones are clean. Of course, there would be a mass of bone and ash and charcoal. They've carefully selected the bones out. I almost wonder if sometimes they may actually wash the bones. But they've been treated with respect and care, placed in the urn. And then, of course, the urn's been inverted and placed in the ground. Obviously, some sort of cover at one time before, as they inverted the urn. And just the picture at the bottom there showing the decoration. They're called collared urns because they have these broad, thick collars above the neck. And then you can see this incised decoration. So not as fancy as the beakers, but usually a lot larger. And a nice thing to find. But another one that's complete chance. It just happened to turn up on that road stripping job. Another road job here, Brackmills Link Road. When in 2000, there was some trial trenching done. Then in 2002, during road construction, we came back. So first of all, we put in some trial trenches. This again is another aerial photograph find, and we put in a trial trench to confirm that it was a round barrow. We got the carbon date from that. And then before the road construction, we put in a small trench, one small cremation burial, carbon dated to the Middle Bronze Age. So we've got another example of an isolated round barrow, but other burials coming in, showing respect for it, and coming in several hundred years later. So all around Northampton, these things have been picked up over the years as development progresses. We'll now move on to, of course, the scale of the development these days is sometimes quite astonishing. So Upton Park, of course, if you drive that way, it's now this great line of warehouses. And of course, to the north up around Sandy Lane area, lots of new housing as well. So the blue are the old sites. These are the ones that have been dug before the most recent development. And there's that little cremation burial that we were looking at before. And this big area been excavated here. And we're going to have a look at that. And there again, when we look at that new area down there, that little tiny circle is another round barrow. These lines are not ditches, they're lines of pits, and we'll be getting onto those in a minute. But first of all, here's another round barrow down by the river this time. So it gives you an idea of the scale of some of these developments now. They've just got bigger and bigger over the years. So, and they've grown a lot since I retired. So huge areas are now being opened up for things like these. Well, when you get these huge housing developments or the warehouse developments, it's large tracts of land that are being opened up. And from the archaeological point of view, of course, the bigger the area, the better in some ways, because you can get a more complete picture. And there you can see there's the round barrow. Sections have been dug across the ditch. There's a plan view of it. And this is why I started off with West Cotton, where we've got this lovely preservation of a central burial. These round barrows are slightly later in date, and they've moved from inhumation to cremation burials. So most likely there would have been a cremation burial in an urn at the centre of that mound, but of course it wouldn't have been buried very deep. So it's just been ploughed away. The only one that survived here, I think, probably that one with the buckets are. They're soil sampling. There was a cremation burial surviving in the ditch fill. So some of these ones we need to find them. Yeah, it all adds to this picture of the landscape. But in terms of excavation, when they've been ploughed out like this, isn't obviously you're fairly limited. You've got to hope for something in the ditches, and very rarely will you get anything surviving in the centre, just because it's the centuries of ploughing has removed the original burials in the centre. We go back now to these long linear, what we know them as in archaeology is pit alignments. They started appearing all across the Midlands when people started doing this intensive aerial photography in the 60s and 70s. And the puzzle was, why are people, instead of doing, they are clearly formed boundaries, but why do you dig a row of pits rather than digging a ditch? Most other periods of history, if you want to demark a pit of land, you dig a ditch around it. But here you have these lines of pits running for hundreds of meters. We usually can't find the ends because they run off the edge of developments. They just disappear into the distance. Also difficult to date. You get very few finds out of them, very little charcoal for carbon dating, if any. So, but we do know they are appearing in this intermediate stage. They're late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, when we don't get much settlement evidence. So, and so here's up and up. Here's one up. This is part of that one, Upton Park, showing the pits. Doesn't really do them justice, this, because this is fairly soft ground and the pits have eroded. If you look at the bottom, you'll see at the base of the pit, it's got a very square, well, rectangular base. And if I'll jump onto another one in the moment, so they aren't just rows of irregular pits. They're actually rows of quite regular pits. This is one. Here we're going back to Briar Hill, 1969. Well-known local archaeologist Dennis Jackson, and so that was the first of these pit alignments to be excavated. Well, quite literally here, within a development area. And Dennis has managed to pick it up as it starts here, and he's managed to dig a few places and confirm that it's carrying on over a long distance. But you can see here, these pits are rectangular, aligned along the line of the alignment. That one's actually a square one, but they're quite regular, uniform pits. So why do you dig steep-sided, flat-bottom pits, all very neat and tidy before they start eroding to make a boundary? No answers. There's still some archaeological mystery of why people went to all this trouble to make these lines of pits rather than just digging a continuous ditch. We come back here back to Briar Hill again. So yes, at Briar Hill we have one of these pit alignments that came right in, just clipping the edge of the enclosure. So it's showing respect for that old Neolithic monument. And we're back out here again to Harleston, and we had a look earlier. We were looking at that causewayed enclosure, but all these P's mean pit alignment. So there's a pit alignment there, pit alignment there. That one carries on through the heathland, reappears there. There's another one down here, and there's another one over there at Harleston Quarry that we excavated some years ago, and also clearly carrying on beyond the quarry. So we have these lengths of boundaries all around Northampton, multiple pit alignments. They're difficult to date and difficult to interpret, but there's lots of them about. And so we've moved through Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and it brings us on finally to where we had something above ground. The Iron Age hill fort on Hunsbury Hill, in that sense, our only extant prehistoric monument, although slightly damaged. Are we looking at more new settlers? Certainly in the late Iron Age, we have people coming over from Gaul to escape the Romans, mainly moving into southeastern England. But the Iron Age is still to be looked at on DNA, and DNA it's being worked on at the moment. So DNA evidence should be coming through about Iron Age populations in the next few years. Of course, once it's sat in glorious isolation beyond the main part of Northampton, and now, of course, it's the housing estates have surrounded Hunsbury Hill, but it has a long story before that. Hunsbury Hill actually was among the very first monuments to be protected in 1882 as a scheduled ancient monument. And that was largely due to the work of Sir Henry Dryden. And just pointing out there, people still tend to call them scheduled ancient monuments, but of course the ancient title was dropped quite a while ago, because these days there are scheduled monuments that aren't all that old, certainly not ancient in archaeological terms anyway. The unfortunate thing, though it was in this first wave of scheduled monuments, along with obviously things like Stonehenge and Avebury and so on. But they only scheduled the earthworks, so the ditch and the bank were scheduled, but nothing else. So when it came to quarrying, they could happily quarry around the outside and through the inside, because the scheduling had just been applied to the visible earthworks, not to the whole of the hill fort. So yes, so 1882, 1886, although it was a scheduled monument, that most of the interior up to that point there was quarried out. And there we see the quarry section, early photograph there. And there's an unusual, what it was full of was pits. So there's one of Henry Dryden's sections, and you can see the pits there appearing in the section. The main band of ironstone is that dark grey, so they're in the more shattered ironstone up at the top. Lots, dozens, probably hundreds of pits. And that's just one in the photograph there is an unusual one in that it's stone lined. Most of them aren't stone lined. But due to the Henry Dryden and the Reverend Baker, the workmen on the quarry were being paid for handing in the finds that they recovered when they were digging through those Iron Age pits. So it's one of the most important assemblages of Iron Age finds in the country, because not many hill forts have had their entire interiors excavated, even if it wasn't in an archaeological sense. At least most of clearly most of the finds were handed in because they were getting paid for doing so. So here we have a look at a few of them. This is as displayed in Northampton Museum, and we've got iron fittings. We've got you can see an obvious horse bit, and we've got all the harness fittings. There's part of the wheel rim. So we've got everything you need is there to build an Iron Age, or a chariot or a cart. So, and again, this suggestion there, we've got two hubs. So it's a single axle. So it's a two-wheeled vehicle. You have all the terret rings for the reins. So we have all the fittings you need for a chariot or cart. But we've got no idea, was it buried complete like the ones up in Yorkshire have been, or had it been dismantled and placed in the pit in parts? We've got no way of ever knowing that now, but everything is there to build a chariot. A couple of Iron Age swords. Not many people in the Iron Age had a sword. You're talking about somebody of very high status to have, and especially this one on the left. This is the decorated copper alloy scabbard. We haven't got the sword, but we've got the scabbard. And then also there was an iron sword, which must have been in a leather scabbard, but we've got the copper alloy shape at the bottom of the scabbard, so it doesn't cut through the leather. So two swords were recovered. The other thing that came in huge quantities from Hunsbury Hill were rotary querns, which may seem a bit down market when you're talking about chariots and swords, but as one of the first labour-saving mechanical devices, and they're made in millstone grit and other stone types from beyond the county, these are actually major items of trade in the late Neolithic. So you're looking at total weight for a quern like that, about 59 kilograms. That's a hefty piece of, two hefty pieces of stone to make your rotary quern for grinding your grain into flour. And 124 stones from querns were found in the pits at Hunsbury Hill, which on that scale, that is not for their own use within the hill fort. The site must have been acting as a trade and distribution centre for these valuable querns, which are being brought down from, or many of them, obviously millstone grit is coming down from the Peak District up in the southern Pennines. So you're moving some very heavy bits of stone over that distance. That alone makes them an expensive major item of trade. And again, yep, I thought 100 objects, there's going to be lots of people put in pretty things. They'll put in jewelry and all the fancy stuff. I wanted to put in something that had a domestic use, but was still a very valuable and respected item. So the rotary quern is, again, one of those 100 objects to represent Northamptonshire and its history. And at this stage, yes, we've also got to mention Dennis Jackson. He was a builder by trade, and he became a full-time field. But he started attending digs and going to evening classes, and eventually became a full-time field archaeologist in the mid-1960s. And he was working on those Department of Environment grants. A lot of his time was spent around Corby on the ironstone quarries, and literally he would walk around the sites when they were stripping them, looking for archaeological sites, and then off to the DOE. So I found an Iron Age settlement, or there's an Anglo-Saxon cemetery and Roman settlement. So a whole range of, but his speciality was the Iron Age. You'd find a settlement site that was in danger of being destroyed, get a grant and excavate it. So through the 70s and 80s, he was a major figure in the county who sites that would otherwise have been quarried away with no record. Dennis was there to excavate them. Towards the end of his career, so it's probably one of the last jobs before he retired, he finally got to come to Hunsbury Hill. He lived just nearby, so he finally got to do a dig at Hunsbury Hill on part of the rampart, and it shows the state the monument's in. So at that time, he excavated. You've got a continuous slot, the black of the timber impressions, and there in section you can see there's the slot. So that to the left, that's what's left of the rampart. There would have been another slot somewhere over here. That's all eroded away into the ditch. On the right-hand side, that vertical face on the right-hand side is the quarry face. So we can see it there. That's where they're quarried right to there. This is all material that are built up against the face of the bank. So that high point there is not actually the top of the bank at all. The bank started here and went in that direction. So we've lost a huge amount of the bank, but some of the material in front of the bank has still survived, but then it's chopped away by the quarrying. So a badly damaged site. But for many years, of course, Hunsbury was the Iron Age in Northampton. It's only really the mid-60s onwards that other settlements start to be found around the area. 1970s, the whole Eastern District and the other developments of the Development Corporation. So we have an Iron Age settlement. That's a road line in Moulton Park. We've got an enclosure, and there, of course, the remains of the timber slots for a roundhouse. There was another on the Blackthorn estate in the Eastern District. There we've got a reconstruction drawing, a double-ditched enclosure with a thatched roof roundhouse within it. As we move on, Wootton Hill Farm, quite near Hunsbury Hill, was another one of these. This is another small farmstead with there's timber work there forming a gateway. We've got one big roundhouse, another timber structure there. So it was a small family farmstead that was excavated by Dennis. Again, that was in the late 80s. And reconstruction there, showing it with its roundhouse and its timbered gateway, a stock pen, granary, stroke watchtower. Very few people. We're back in the Bronze Age. We had all those lovely beaker burials. In the Iron Age, very few people end up in the ground. So we have the skeletons of relatively few Iron Age people. But pushing it a bit here, perhaps this is a water pipeline between Brackmills and Great Houghton. So it's still that sort of outer Northampton. And we're excavating there in the 1990s. And nice circular pit. But surprisingly, in the pit we had this crouched burial, face down, head up against the side. But what made this even more special, that was quite rare on its own. It's only occasionally you find burials in pits. Around a woman, late 40s, around her neck, we had this lead tin alloy collar. So lead tin alloy would look, when it was new and shiny, it would look pretty much like silver. And there's the terminals that normally you'd have at the front, but they'd actually, as she was lying face down, it had been turned round. So the terminals were at the back of her neck. And got a drilled hole there and a couple of slots there. So it was fixed together with nothing had survived. So it must have been some sort of organic piece of leather that was holding it together. That was chosen by the museum as one of the 100 objects. That's something else you can you can see in the exhibition. Well, Northampton to M1, of course, the whole Swan Valley and Pineham development's been another long-running development in Northampton. So back in the early 2000s, on the Swan Valley site, there's another Iron Age enclosure with its roundhouses. And of course, the Pineham development has hugely expanded Swan Valley with multiple large warehouses. That was Northamptonshire Archaeology before one warehouse development in 2007 excavated an Iron Age enclosure there. And then there's obviously other plots associated with it. And University of Leicester, 2013-14, excavated the next bit of the site with another enclosure with a big roundhouse. So here we can see multiple Iron Age roundhouses across a sizable land. Oh, that's another round barrow there as well. So we're seeing with some of this, from an archaeological point of view, some of these new developments are uncovering much more extensive landscapes than we got to see in the past. So archaeologically, they're good. If you want a town full of giant, large warehouses, which is another question. Brack Mills, again, they've had more development there on the Brack Mills industrial estate. This is a lovely one because this is modern geophysics. Right back at the beginning, I showed you that little black and white outline of Briar Hill done with a very early version of geophysics in the old days. This is the sort of quality you can get now. The stripes, that's all ridge and furrow. And that was actually very well preserved in the ground. It's unfortunate that was all that site's been built over because it was probably some of the best ridge and furrow close to Northampton that I know about anyway, or knew about. It was a lovely piece of ridge and furrow and shows up well on the geophysics. But down in this area, you can see these are all the ditches of an Iron Age into Roman settlement site. So that was excavated before development. Here you get into something more complex than the others. Quite often you get Iron Age settlements were abandoned either around about the time of the Roman conquest. So you get an Iron Age settlement and the Roman settlement will be somewhere else. In this case, we have a long period of development on the one site. So one of those pit alignments again, coming from the early Iron Age. The brown, there's an early Iron Age, there's a middle Iron Age enclosure with its circular ditch. Late Iron Age is more roundhouses, a bit faint there in the green, but there's more roundhouses appearing there. So we have this Iron Age settlement there. And then they go straight into, it is, you can see it is abandoned because these Roman ditches go over the top. Essentially, they've just moved next door. So they've moved, the Iron Age settlement has been literally relocated next door, and we have a whole ditch system. This is all related to the various periods of Roman activity. So while in some cases, the Iron Age life comes to an end and the Roman life starts up nearby. In other cases like this, it can literally be on the more or less on the same site. So while we're dealing with prehistory, as there's a gap between prehistory and the Saxons that I've spoken about before, we'll stray over into the Roman for a bit. And this is I try to avoid Roman sites, but this happened by accident. This is Woottonfield's Roman villa back in 1999. 2002. This was an old planning consent with no archaeological requirement. So the developer could just start running his machinery through. And he started stripping a length here for Hall Road. Dennis Jackson, who we spoke about earlier, had retired by then, but he was asked to keep an eye on it. There was no money for a paid archaeological involvement in it, but Dennis kept an eye on it. And as they were coming down the hill, he started to see stonework and pottery was turning up. So we had the likelihood of a Roman villa sitting on that site. It certainly wasn't Dennis. This the giveaway here. This is the hypercaust of a Roman bathhouse system. It was actually covered by the concrete slab floor was in situ. Somebody, certainly not Dennis, said, "Oh, it's probably modern. I think you can take that off." So the construction workers got a machine in, lifted up the concrete, and of course underneath the concrete were the pile tiles of the hypercaust. It wasn't modern concrete; it was Roman concrete. So unfortunately, they took the floor off, but of course it certainly confirmed that the whole site was Roman. But with no money to deal with it, what happened was there was a weekend of organised chaos, I think is the best way to describe it. We got volunteers in from around the county, and me and a couple of other people worked over the weekend unpaid to supervise it, because it needed, you can see the state of it there, it's a mess after the machinery's run over it. So the first job was to just get people to clean the site up. We could then make a record of what was there and put that to English Heritage so they knew exactly what had happened. You can't just say there's a site, a plan and a location, so they can actually look at it. There's my trusty, those days, using a total station theodolite, so we can actually tie it all into the OS map. And what we came up with was this in the end. They were English Heritage paid for a geophysics survey to put it into context. They also paid for doing some excavation along. This is going to be what's now Kirtley Hill. It's the estate road. So we did get to excavate that strip. But I have to say, the villa itself was not excavated. It was cleaned. We got the best plan we could from the cleaning. Of course, some of it had been pretty well hammered by the machinery. And there's part of another hypercourse. That's the hypercourse for the bathhouse. There's another hypercourse there for obviously one of the main living rooms. And we excavated parts of those slots to get some pottery. So we had some sealed pottery rather than stuff off the surface to give us some dates. I won't go into. We did come back and dig an area to the east later, so we got a lot more detail. And certainly in its final, in the late Roman period, it had been used as there'd been iron smelting going on the site as well, which is probably where it says hearths and ovens. Again, we didn't excavate these, but this is probably part of the metalworking complex that's still there, preserved, because having cleaned it and recorded it, what happened then was it was backfilled. So we've laid terram down, so we've got a geotextile membrane laid over the archaeology. It's backfilled with soil, and then that area was reserved from building. So it sits there still as an open space within the housing. The developer redesigned his housing layout and if you go to the modern map, that area there is the site of the villa. There's the road bit that we did excavate, and so the rest of the villa sits around there. And we've got Villa Way and Chariot Road and Centurion Way and Roman Close. And I gave a lecture at Wootton earlier this year, and yes, about 70 people turned up, a lot of them living in places like Villa Way and Roman Close, didn't have the slightest idea why those names were there until they came along and heard the lecture about how the villa had been, well, accidentally found and recorded and preserved in the 1990s. So we've jumped on here now to no, one last one to go. So a little way away from that, is the Caroline Chisholm school site. We did a little bit of work there. There's ditch systems, Roman ditch systems. Probably the most interesting thing was this late Roman coin hoard, and there it is. That's the official photograph for that's also in the history of Northamptonshire in 100 objects. And you've got lots of late Roman bronze coins. That's actually would be the bottom of the pot. Most of the sherds have come off, and they would have been standing upright. At some point, it's probably got hit by ploughing, and that's where the coins have spilled out. But all the copper coins have corroded into a solid mass. So there's a few loose coins, the date on it, and the rest is still there. About estimated to be 1900 coins in a corroded mass. And of course, late Roman coinage is losing its value. The Roman Empire is about to collapse, and the Anglo-Saxons will soon be on their way. At which point, of course, we've arrived where some of my earlier lectures began, and we're just about coming to the end. And the important thing, of course, is not just to find the archaeology, but it's to publish it. So this is what I still do now. I'm editor of the County Journal for Northamptonshire Archaeological Society. Our last volume was specialising on the Iron Age. Usually it's a mix of things of all periods. And here I am at Stannick Lakes, demonstrating the power of the rotary quern. And that brings me to the end of the prehistory of Northampton.